The art of camouflage is pretty well known, and for the most part, it doesn't change that much between a soldier putting on face paint and a ship with dazzle camouflage. You're trying to disguise yourself and make it harder to be hit, or noticed at all, by breaking up patterns or making it harder to judge speed and distance. This applies equally between men on foot, tanks, ships, or aircraft. However, camouflage can sometimes go a step further, and in today's video, we'll be looking at 4 interesting and kind of weird examples from naval history. I've covered all 4 at various points, although one was only in passing, and another was a recent video of its own. But for those who have missed the previous videos, we'll have these stories together here, if only focused on the disguises themselves. 2 British ships, 1 Dutch, and 1 German. If you have more examples, by all means, toss them in the comments, and I'd be happy to do a follow-up. I already have at least one other example that I'm saving in the hopes of a follow-up video. For now, let's start with the first of our 2 British examples. The one with the least material, admittedly, but still an interesting topic. And that would be Fleet Tender C, a ship of many names. She began her life as SSC Landic, a White Star Ocean liner, before bouncing between owners and picking up 2 other names, Mamalis and Mamari III respectively. Her merchant career would span from 1911 through to 1939, and was a successful, if pretty quiet affair, before she was ultimately sold to the British Admiralty in 1939 for military service. I imagine that Cunard, by now the owners of the ship, probably expected her to be used as a troop ship, or a freighter. But no, that's not what happened here. For whatever reason, I haven't found much in the way of detail, the Admiralty elected to convert the ship instead. And by convert, I mean disguise her as an aircraft carrier. Mamari III was renamed to Fleet Tender C and had a mock flight deck and superstructure built atop her hull. Presumably, she was judged too old and slow for use as a troop ship. And in fairness, this ship was less than 10,000 tons and could make around 13 knots. A fast ship she was not. If I had to guess, that's why she wasn't considered for troop ship duty. Regardless, Fleet Tender C was disguised as HMS Hermes, which had a quite distinctive look, not least because of her proportionally massive island. So when the tender was rebuilt to look like Hermes, it was quite a bit of effort. The mock flight deck was one thing. The mock island was another entirely. I haven't found detail on how long this work took. The ship was sold to the British Admiralty in September of 1939, and they planned to remove the disguise in June 1941. So at some point in 1940, the ship came out looking almost identical to HMS Hermes, unless they managed to complete the work in a couple months in 1939. Either way, this disguise worked from a distance. If you know Hermes well, you can pick out the differences in the shape of the island and the general hull form. But it wasn't meant to fool someone up close. Much like the other British example, this was meant to fool German pilots, who often had other concerns to worry about and wouldn't know how to spot the differences anyway. Arguably, this disguise did its job. On June 4th, 1941, the ship was on her way to dock to be converted to a cargo ship. However, Hermes, and you can't see my air quotes here, was attacked by German aircraft. In dodging those attacks, the ship collided with a sunken wreck. This sank her in shallow water, where German torpedo boats would finish the ship off. One presumes the Germans thought they were actually sinking Hermes, with the amount of effort they put in. So the XC Landix disguise did its job. This would also apply, if in less dramatic fashion, to the second British example, a contemporary one from the same war, except this time it involved a battleship dressing up as another battleship. That ship was HMS Centurion, one of the first King George V class battleships. For the most part, this ship had a fairly quiet life. For most of the Great War, Centurion was occupied with patrol and training. She would only see one combat action in the form of Jutland, and even then, Centurion didn't exactly cover herself in glory. She fired a grand total of 19 shells aimed for SMS Lutzo. Not one of those is recorded as hitting. Frankly, Centurion would probably have been one of many forgotten battleships at this point. She was put in reserve in the early 1920s, outdated and surplus to requirements. She would only survive by virtue of being converted to a target ship, a role she would last in throughout the late 1920s and the entirety of the 1930s, and a role she was still in with the outbreak of the Second World War in September 1939. Centurion would initially sit this out in port as various schemes were cooked up, from conversion to an anti-aircraft ship to block ship duty. None of those would go anywhere, with the ship seeing no real use at first. This changed at some point between 1939 and 1941. Sources disagree on the exact date. Regardless of when it happened, Centurion was taken in for a conversion. The ship had fake turrets and superstructure put aboard to disguise her as HMS Anson. That ship was under construction, and someone along the chain of command decided, hey, let's use Centurion to fool the Germans. And in fairness, that disguise proved very well done. The superstructure isn't exact, the hull form is different, and Centurion lacked the secondary battery entirely. But, just like with Fleet Tender C, that didn't really matter. The intention was to fool aircraft, and for that, Centurion worked quite well. With a funny note in her class, Centurion was, as mentioned, part of the first King George V class. Anson was a member of the second King George V class, meaning Centurion was disguised as a ship of a class that had the same name as her own. One of those fun little historical ironies. In any case, that disguise will be put to use in June 1942. Centurion was part of a convoy escort from Alexandria to Malta, during which she was attacked by 9 German dive bombers, seemingly fooled by her disguise. Only slight damage was done from near misses, while Centurion, fitted with some 20mm cannon, downed one of the bombers. That would ultimately be her only combat duty in the Second World War. Centurion ended her life as one of the block ships off Omaha Beach as part of the Mulberry Harbor Project, one final use for an old and outdated ship. It does mean we're at 2 ships lost, 1 to sinking and 1 to block ship duty out of 2. The third ship would have a better end, and that's the Dutch minesweeper Abraham Crijnssen. As I just covered this ship last week, I'll be shorter on this section. As with the other two that have videos, I'll link her full story in the description. The short version is this. A small and slow minesweeper, Abraham Crijnssen, was based in the Dutch East Indies when the Japanese declared war on December 8th, December 7th on the Hawaii side of the dateline, 1941. While other warships fought the Japanese and suffered for it, this little ship remained in harbor. She might have covered convoys or other such things, but unfortunately, there's very little written on her service. Regardless, in the aftermath of the Battle of the Java Sea on February 27, 1942, the Dutch faced a choice. They could no longer hope to resist the Japanese invasion, especially not after Exeter, Euston, and Perth were sunk in the aftermath of that battle. Any warships left in the East Indies had to either be scuttled or attempt to brave Japanese blockades to escape to Australia. This included 4 minesweepers based in Surabaya, including Abraham Crijnssen. One of those minesweepers was scuttled in port, with the captain unwilling to take the risk. That was Peter de Bitter. The other 3 departed on March 6, 1942, to try and escape. Of those, one would be scuttled due to faulty boilers on March 8th after the Japanese spotted her. This ship was Elan Dubois. The third, Jan van Amstel, was run down and sunk by the Japanese destroyer Arashio. That left Abraham Crijnssen under the command of Anthony von Mert. This little minesweeper would be disguised in an ingenious manner. The Dutch crew covered the ship in trees and branches while painting the exposed hull gray to mimic rocks. She would then moor next to islands during the day to finish the illusion of being just another Indonesian island. The ship only sailed at night to avoid the Japanese picking up on the moving island. While it's not entirely clear if the Japanese ever spotted her at all, the disguise still did its job. Abraham Crijnssen eventually made it to Australia on March 15, 1942, almost out of fuel, but still intact. She would spend the rest of the war in Australian waters, ultimately surviving the entire conflict. And for that matter, the rest of the 20th century as well. The ship managed to endure until 1995, at which point she was turned into a museum ship in the Netherlands, a role she remains in to this day. A darling of the internet naval history community for her famous escape. Unfortunately, the same can't be said for our final example. For that, we return to the Great War, specifically September of 1914. In the early days of that conflict, German ocean liners would be put to work as armed merchant cruisers. Some were more successful and famous than others. For today, we'll look at one of the less successful examples. Although one of the more famous, in spite of her lack of success. This is also a topic I've covered before in greater detail. The story began on April 10, 1914, when a new German ocean liner sailed her maiden voyage. This ship was the Cap Trafalgar, or Cape Trafalgar in English, a modern ocean liner and the largest vessel on the South American route. Sadly for her, she came into service too late to make use of that. When World War I was in full swing, in August of 1914, Cap Trafalgar was in Brazil. The German Navy promptly took her into service as an auxiliary cruiser. The liner sailed to Montevideo for coal before anchoring off the Brazilian island of Trinidad. where she would meet up with the gunboat SMS Eber in late August to receive German Navy crewmen, along with weaponry and ammunition to go along with those men. This consisted of two 4.1-inch or 10.5 centimeter guns, along with 6 one-pounder pom-poms, which you normally think of as a British weapon, but the Germans also used at the time. Cap Trafalgar also had her third dummy funnel removed, not to save weight, but for disguise purposes. The Germans in both world wars would disguise their auxiliary cruisers as other merchant ships, or ocean liners, as the case may be. This was famously done by Cormoran in her sinking of HMS Sydney. For Cap Trafalgar, it was done to disguise her as a British Cunard liner, more specifically RMS Carmania, an older but larger and faster vessel. This is noteworthy for a reason we're about to see. First, however, the newly disguised liner, now codenamed Hilfskreutzer B, set out to hunt British shipping. Unfortunately for the Germans, this came to nothing. They didn't find any enemy merchants, so Cap Trafalgar returned to her Brazilian island base on September 13th, 1914, for refueling, during which the actual Carmania spotted her on a mission to hunt German raiders. Carmania had been refit by the British with a heavier loadout, 8 4.7-inch guns. Some online sources will say that she was painted up as Cap Trafalgar to really sell the story, but this seems to be a myth. From what I've seen, Carmania was painted up in a dull military paint scheme. In any event, the crew came across a ship disguised as their own vessel. The following battle, as Carmania overtook the slower German liner, is legendary. 2 ocean liners fighting it out like old sailing vessels, broadsides and all. Ultimately, Carmania's heavier weaponry saw her come out the victor. Cap Trafalgar would be sunk, while Carmania would survive with heavy damage. In fact, she eventually returned to civilian service, lasting into the 1930s. Not a bad result, all things being equal. That said, we've reached the end of this video. Again, if you have other examples, not counting our Finnish friend, by all means toss them in the comments. I'd be happy to do another video. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.